Okay, thank you, Lubash. Thank you. I want to thank Jim and Avner for inviting our paper. I want to thank Jessica for going through all of the trouble, including reading our paper to be here to discuss the paper. It's a joint work with Anmol Bhanderi at Economics Department at University of Minnesota. The goal of the paper is to introduce agency frictions into general equilibrium and use the tools from dynamic agency and general equilibrium analysis to shed light on some of the important puzzles in asset pricing. For example, the equity premium puzzle, the predictability of returns over time, and the value premium. In addition, to use that model to understand some of the important questions in macro in particular, I would say it's a disconnection between labor market dynamics and TFP shocks. I would summarize the challenge for general equilibrium-based asset pricing theory as it's difficult to generate a high volatility pricing kernel, and it's difficult to produce a substantial variation of the volatility of the pricing kernel over time that's needed for predictability of returns. And it's hard to produce a large exposure of firms' cash flows with respect to aggregate shocks. So our model, we're going to show that dynamic agency generates uninsurable idiosyncratic labor income risk in a way that resolves the above puzzles. The important channel in our model that we emphasize is that the labor income, the idiosyncratic labor income risk, will feed back into the pricing kernel. The important challenge for RBC models to account for business cycle fluctuations is the fact that most of the discrepancy between theory and data is what Charakeho-McGrattan would call a labor wedge, in the sense that a lot of movements in unemployment doesn't seem to be very connected to TFP movements. And a recent example is that during the Greek recession, there's not a lot of change in measured TFP, but for whatever reason, there seems to be persistent increases in unemployment rate. In our model, we're going to introduce a long-term contracting approach to labor market, so that the discount rate variations will feed back into the model that generate persistent movement in employment. I guess the main takeaway for our paper is that it is important to understand the general equilibrium feedback between labor and capital markets. In doing so, we're going to provide a unified theory for asset pricing and for labor market dynamics. For the purpose of today's talk, I'm going to focus on the asset pricing part. So our approach is that we're going to embed optimal contracting in a general equilibrium framework where a diversified owners of firms insure workers against using long-term compensation contracts. In our model, contract is going to be restricted by limited commitment from both workers and employers. We're also going to have a moral hazard firms retention effort, which is important for labor market dynamics, but not so much for asset pricing. Our key results are going to be that first, we show that firm-side limited commitment is going to generate tail risk in earnings and labor earnings. As a result, the consumption share of well-diversified marginal investor, including the capital owners, is procyclical. Therefore, our model is going to have a more volatile pricing kernel relative to an otherwise identical representative agent economy. We're going to show that cash flow exposure is going to be higher in our model relative due to agency frictions relative to a representative agent economy. Finally, moral hazard is quantitatively important because in our model, it's going to amplify the primitive shocks that would generate persistent changes in labor market movements and amplify the volatility of the pricing kernel. In the interest of time, I'm gonna skip the literature review. Let me go directly to the model. It's gonna be a discrete time model, infinite horizon. There's gonna be two group of agents, workers and capital owners. Both have absence-in type of preferences. So in our model, the output for worker J's output is gonna be equal to aggregate productivity, which is uppercase YT times worker specific productivity as JT. So aggregate productivity, the growth rate of aggregate productivity is gonna follow a Markov chain. The growth rate of idiosyncratic productivity will be independent across firms and across time. Importantly, the distribution of idiosyncratic productivity, epsilon J, will depend on aggregate shocks. In particular, it's gonna be more volatile in recessions than in booms in our model. In our model, capital owners is going to be diversified, well diversified across all firms. They're going to offer labor compensation contracts which specifies compensation as a function of the history of aggregate and idiosyncratic productivity shocks. Firm maximize the present value of the cash flow, which include current period output YT. A theta T is the cost of retention effort. CT is going to be a compensation for a particular firm. Theta T is the probability that the firm worker match is going to continue into the next period. And the expression in the square bracket is the present value of the future cash flow. Workers' utility follows a standard absence-in preference. In our model, we have three kind of agency frictions. Firms cannot commit to compensation contracts that give them a negative NPV at any point in time. So limited commitment on firm side is going to require that the present value of the firm's cash flow to be non-negative at all times and after all histories. Worker is going to have some outside options. So the fact that worker cannot commit to compensation contracts that give them lower continuation utility than their outside options require that the utility for workers under the optimal contract has to be higher than their outside options. Finally, there's going to be more hazard in the choice of theta, which is firm's retention effort. That requires that because theta is not observable to workers, that moral hazard incentive compatibility with respect to moral hazard requires the firm value has to be higher than the present value of the cash flow under any alternative plans for the retention effort trace. As in a standard dynamic contracting literature, promise utility can be used to summarize the history, the relevant information in history that's relevant for the design of the optimal contract. Different from most of the dynamic contracting literature, in our model aggregate, there's going to be a model with aggregate shocks, therefore aggregate state variable. In particular, the distribution of the cross-section of promise utilities will be important in summarizing the aggregate relevant history in the design of the optimal contract. We show that in our model that because of the homotheticity of preferences and technologies, the value function of the firm divided by worker-specific productivity can be represented as a function of normalized utility, where normalized utility is the continuation utility of workers divided by productivity. In addition, typically, we're just like in Krusal-Smith, we're going to need the cross-sectional joint cross-sectional distribution of promise utility and worker productivity to keep track of aggregate information. We showed that in our model, because of constant return to scale, the aggregation relevant information can be summarized by a measure defined on the one-dimensional space of normalized promise utility to summarize history. With that, the optimal contract can be specified that given the stochastic discount factor and law of motion of the distribution of promise utilities, firm maximize profit, subject to promise keeping constraint, firm side limited commitment, that says firm value has to be non-negative at all times, and worker side limit commitment, which says the worker's continuous utility has to be higher than the outside options, moral hazard, which says the incentive compatibility constraint of moral hazard requires that the choice of retention, which is theta effort, has to be optimal from the firm's perspective. In our model, we showed that that IC constraint can be replaced by the first order condition of retention effort. We showed that in our model that the first order approach is going to be necessary and sufficient for solving the optimal contract with respect to the moral hazard problem. Capital owners are well diversified. The maximization of the capital owners problem basically produce an equation that relates the stochastic discount factor to the marginal rate of substitution of capital owners. So let me summarize our equilibrium concept. The equilibrium concept is that given the stochastic discount factor lambda and the law of motion of the distribution of promised utilities gamma, the choice of compensation, retention effort, and continuous utilities for workers has to solve the optimal contracting problem. Capital owners' consumption have to solve capital owners' intertemporal maximization problem. Second, the prices, i.e. the stochastic discount factor, has to be chosen such that market clears. Finally, the distribution of the law of motion, the distribution of promised utility at the aggregate level has to be consistent with the law of motion of continuous utility specified by the optimal contract. So that's the second and third requirement, is the general equilibrium part of the analysis. Let me go to the, so let me first explain the theoretical insights of the model before I talk about quantitative analysis. Our first result, we have three main theoretical results. The first result is that optimal contract with respect to limited commitment generates tail risk in earnings. Obviously, with full commitment, without any agency frictions, the optimal contract is going to specify that capital owners insure workers against their idiosyncratic shocks. So in that economy, everyone's consumption would have to be a constant fraction of aggregate consumption, as in neoclassical models. The key friction that generates tail risk, idiosyncratic tail risk in earnings, is the firm side limited commitment. It's the fact that firms cannot commit to negative NPV projects. We show that in our model, optimal contract under limited commitment involves, prescribes that workers' compensation to be a constant fraction of aggregate consumption whenever the limited commitment constraint does not bind, and implement a minimum reduction in workers' compensation whenever limited commitment does constraint from the firm side does bind. So this is a world in which if I receive a negative productivity shock, suppose I receive a sufficiently large negative productivity shock, University of Minnesota is going to reevaluate my compensation contract. They're going to say, hey, Hengjie is not producing any papers for us, so the compensation contract for him is going to be negative NPV from the employer's perspective. And let's cut his compensation to by half. If I receive further, more negative productivity shocks, there's going to be a larger drop in labor compensation. Therefore, firm side limited commitment is a type of agency constraint that's going to generate uninsured risk in the left tail of idiosyncratic productivity shock. We know from the asset pricing literature that's going to be a powerful mechanism in generating large variations in marginal utilities. And so that's kind of the most important agency friction in our model. But unlike the exogenously incomplete market model, for example, Constantine and Duffy, in our model, where idiosyncratic shock is endogenous, the fact that tail risks are uninsured is because some incentive compatibility constraint is binding. Uh, in exogenous incomplete market models, once you have tail risk in consumption, for example, in constant needs and traffic, you're going to have a more volatile pricing kernel. In our model, however, the tail risk, the uninsured tail risk, is because someone's agent incentive compatibility constraint is binding. Whenever that IC constraint is binding, those agents are not going to be the one who price the market. They're not going to be the marginal investors. So to think about asset pricing implications in a model with endogenously incomplete market, we would have to focus on the marginal investors whose incentive compatibility constraint does not bind. And therefore, to illustrate our second result, which is agency frictions produce a higher risk premium, we would have to focus on a marginal investor whose constraint does not bind. So I'm gonna illustrate the intuition using a simple example and leave the quantitative result later. Let me make several assumptions. Assumption one is that the aggregate productivity shock has to be persistent. That's absolutely necessary for our result. Second, there's going to be counter-cyclical idiosyncratic risk. That's motivated by the empirical evidence documented by Gouvenon, for example, Laurie Schmidt and Konstantin Gosh. And for a theoretical assumption, here I'm going to assume that the idiosyncratic shock is going to follow a negative exponential distribution in recessions. There's going to be no idiosyncratic shock in booms. So countercyclicality is the most important part of the assumption. Third, I'm going to leave only one agency friction so that I can prove some theoretical result, which is the firm side limited commitment. Lastly, I'm going to make one simplification. I'm going to assume that there's no insurance from period 2 and on. I will focus on the optimal contracting problem in period 0 and 1 so that I can prove some theorems to illustrate the basic result intuition of our model. So introduce some notations. X0 is the consumption share of well-diversified capital owners. X high and W high are the consumption share and continuation utility of the capital owners. X low and W low is the consumption share and continuation utility of the capital owners in recessions. C is the consumption share of workers. C high and U high is consumption and continuation utility of workers. The consumption and continuation utility of workers in recessions, C low and U low, are gonna depend on the realization of idiosyncratic shock epsilon as well, because epsilon has a non-trivial distribution only in recessions. Before I go on to the main result, let me just mention that for a representative agent model to produce a more volatile pricing kernel, it has to be that the consumption of marginal investors would have to be more volatile and more procyclical than the consumption of average investor. So the key to understand our result is to understand why the consumption of the well-diversified investors, and in this case, our capital owners, has to be procyclical. So we're basically looking for parameterization of the model such that X high, the consumption share of the capital owner in booms, is higher than X low. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the marginal investor's consumption to be more volatile than the aggregate, than the average investor. So here's our key result. We're gonna allow recursive utility. Our gamma is risk aversion size in IES. Our first result is that under expected utility, if gamma is equal to 1 over psi, then X high is lower than X low. So the consumption of well-diversified marginal investor would be counter-cyclical in expected utility, even if you have tail risk in recession, in labor earnings, you're gonna have a less volatile pricing kernel relative to representative agent economy. Under recursive utility, our result says that if gamma is large enough, you will always have a more procyclical consumption for marginal investors. So recursive utility is the key that makes a difference in our model that produces a more volatile pricing kernel. So to understand our result, that the consumption share of capital owners is going to be determined by the optimal return condition, which says the marginal rate of substitution of capital owners in recessions relative to in booms. The ratio of the two has to be equal to the marginal rate of substitution of any unconstrained workers. In particular, the marginal worker who realize a negative productivity shock just enough so that their limited commitment constraint is just not binding. So these are, we're gonna say that this is, you know, the idiosyncratic productivity shock as epsilon bar. These are the realization of idiosyncratic productivity shocks such that the constraint is just not, will be bind if for any epsilon that's lower than epsilon bar. And market current, so of course the first, it's the optimality condition, and together with market current condition that determines the dynamics of X. So with expect utility, that marginal optimal return condition just boils down, because marginal utility only depends on current period consumption. That optimal return condition basically boils down to an equation that says the consumption, the share of the consumption of capital owners in recessions relative to booms would have to be equal to the share of consumption of the marginal worker in recessions relative to booms. Remember that with limited commitment, whenever workers set limit commitment constraint binds, consumption has to go down. The optimal contract would have to cut compensation in a way to respect the firm side limit commitment. So constrained workers' consumption has to bind. Market clearing condition implies that any unconstrained worker will have more resources. So therefore, in a model with limited commitment, the share of consumption of workers in booms, the share of the marginal investors' consumption in booms is equal to the share of the average worker in booms, because there's no idiosyncratic shock. Everybody is the same. Marginal guy is the same as the average person. In recessions, however, the share of consumption of the marginal worker has to be larger than the share of consumption of the average worker, because whoever has a binding constraint, their consumption has to go down. The unconstrained worker's consumption share would necessarily be higher than the consumption share of an average worker. Optimal resharing requires that, you know, there's more resources around. So what do? We're gonna give part of the consumption to the capital owner. We're gonna give part of the consumption to unconstrained workers. As a result, X low is gonna be higher than X high, just because whenever limited commitment constraint is binding, you cut the consumption of the constrained workers, but they're not gonna be the marginal investor. General equilibrium market has to clear. Resource constraint implies that you're going to use the actual resource to compensate the unconstrained person, which implies that the marginal investor's consumption would be higher in recessions than in booms. This is result where I emphasized earlier that under the expect utility, you have tail risk, but you have a less volatile pricing kernel, because consumption share of marginal investors would be counter-cyclical. With recursive preference, the key difference is that the marginal utility depend not only on current period consumption, but more importantly, on continuation utility in the future. Think about the marginal investor worker whose constraint is not binding in this period, but is likely to bind in the future because productive shocks are persistent. So even though his constraint is not binding in the current period, he may even receive a slightly higher consumption because the market clearing mechanism that I introduced earlier. But the fact that the constraint is very likely to bind in the future really scares the recursive utility maximizer. He's going to have an extremely low marginal utility if the gamma is high enough. As a result, the marginal utility of a marginal worker is going to be high whenever, because his limited commitment constraint is likely to be high in the future. optimal risk sharing implies that well-diversified capital owners would have to compensate the marginal worker who's really scared about the pessimistic future that where the limit commitment constraint may be binding. Therefore, part of the resources reallocates from capital owners from workers. As a result, capital owners' consumption will be low because of this optimal sharing mechanism between capital owners and unconstrained marginal worker whose constraint may not be binding in the current period, but is likely to bind in the future. This explains our result that with recursive utility, if gamma is high enough, the consumption of capital owners will be procyclical and therefore amplifies the volatility of the pricing kernel in our model. Once you have the consumption or the payment to capital owners to be more procyclical, you also have the aggregate dividend, which is payout to capital owners to be more procyclical than output. Therefore, the cash flow in our model is going to have a higher beta compared to the standard representative agent economy. In addition, in a cross section, the more constrained worker firms that where workers are more constrained is going to have a higher risk exposure just because their cash flow is going to have it's going to be more procyclical. And so what we show is that in the cross section, expected return of firms' cash flow is going to be increasing in promised utility. The interpretation is that in fact, the book to market ratio of the firms is also increasing in promised utility, so that our model will be able to generate something that just look like a value premium in the cross section. So let me, so I guess I have 3 or 4 minutes. Let me go to the quantitative result. Let me skip the detail of the calibration. In our model, we have a lot of quantitative result, but let me just show you the key result of the key asset pricing result of the equity premium. So in an otherwise identical, we basically calibrate our model to match aggregate consumption dynamics and labor share dynamics. We show that in our model, without agency frictions, you're going to get less than 0.5% of the equity premium. And that's the equity premium puzzle. With agency frictions, our model produced about 3.5% of the equity premium for unlevered firm cash flow. The equity premium for the very constrained firm in our model is about 6%. So that indicates there's a lot of dispersion in the cross section of expected returns. We're going to have the aggregate, the return is going to be very volatile in our model. We have about 10% volatility, where a model without aggregate, without agency frictions has about 2% volatility in returns. So that's sort of the volatility puzzle. We have a relatively low risk-free rate, level of a low risk-free rate. The volatility risk-free interest rate in our model is slightly higher than the representative agent economy, but it's sort of in the ballpark, the estimations, especially compared to some of the recent estimates. So let me wrap up. We provide a unified theory of asset pricing and labor market dynamics. We show that agency frictions and in general equilibrium, the labor markets and capital markets interact each other in a way that produce a higher market price of risk and generates high operating leverage that help us resolve a lot of asset pricing puzzles. We also show that in our model, which I don't really have a lot of time to explain in detail, that discrete rate shocks generate persistent movement in unemployment, and that feedback to asset prices mainly through the moral hazard channel. Thank you very much.